Our speaker this morning for our first session is Dr. George Murphy. I have been looking forward to this closing final plenary session because he embodies what we have tried to do over these last several days. Someone who was trained in physics with a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, an ordained minister who has been a pastor and continues to serve in pastoral ministry. He writes about preaching in science. He writes about theology and science. His ministry takes him into educational venues of all types and the use of media in all ways to help Christian people understand better and to celebrate the wonder of God's world. And so we've asked him to be our presenter at this last session to help us bring things together. And so, George, please come and lead us.
Enjoy his love 8 o'clock classes when you were in college. The title of that I was given was The Doctrine of Creation as Foundational. And I would want to tweak that a little bit and say it is the foundational role of a realistic doctrine of creation. Let me begin by talking about the senses in which a doctrine of creation is really fundamental for Christianity, and some senses that I think in which people misunderstand that role of creation. We begin in our confession of faith, for example, in the Apostles' Creed, by saying, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. So really creation comes second. God comes first, of course. But we know God only through God's revelation in creation and God's activity in creation. And so in that sense, we have to have some understanding of the world as creation. And we also ought to note, before we even get to either God or creation, we say, I, or perhaps better in the Nicene Creed, we. Who are the we who make this confession of faith? And that already points toward the idea that we understand ourselves to be God's creatures. And as Mike was saying, that's going to be what the whole conference next year is going to focus on. And so it is true that creation really is an essential topic for theology. It is essential for our thinking, for our teaching, for our preaching. But there are senses in which people, I think, misunderstand. For those of you who were at the workshops in here yesterday afternoon, this will be a little bit repetitive. Genesis is not the most important book in the Bible. It is not even the most important book in the Old Testament. What is fundamental for the people of Israel is the Exodus. God, for Israel, is virtually identified as whoever or whatever it was that got us out of Egypt. And in fact, in the New Testament, there are more quotations from the book of Exodus than there are from Genesis. As a matter of fact, there are more from Isaiah and Psalms as well. Exodus has always been seen by the church as the primary type in the Old Testament of the cross and resurrection of Christ. And the Exodus is God's redemption of Israel, but it is also seen really as God's creation of Israel. God made Israel a people by bringing them through the sea into freedom. And then, and so that's where the people of Israel really start. And all their confessions of faith go back not to the Garden of Eden and Adam, but go back to the Exodus. But then they begin to reflect on what that means. And so if you look, for example, at the very important confession of faith that they are to make in the 26th chapter of Deuteronomy, what is that confession of faith? It's a wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and became a great nation, and Pharaoh enslaved them, and God brought them out of Egypt. But notice the context in which that is placed. That is to be done when you go to the priest with your first fruits and say unto him, I profess this day that the Lord your God, that I have come into the country that the Lord swore to give to our fathers. It's at the time of the bringing of the first fruits, it's implicitly a confession that it's God who has provided for them. So an understanding of creation, it begins to expand to God's provision for the people, and expands back in time until when you get to 2nd Isaiah, there's the idea that God is the creator not just of Israel, but of the whole universe. Furthermore, creation is not important simply because it tells us how we got started. The kind of popular understanding of creation like that can, in a sense, really trivialize creation. Because it kind of says, okay, God created the world perfectly, and we messed it up with sin, and now we're going to go on and talk about salvation and kind of the really important message of the church. God didn't just create the world in the beginning, and in fact, God did not create a perfect world at all. The Bible never says God created the world perfect to start with. God created a world intended to develop toward the end that God was pointing it toward. So creation is really about eschatology as well as about the beginning, and you see that already in that first creation account in Genesis, in which ends not just with the creation of human beings, but ends with the creation of the Sabbath, which the Jews, at least, Christians often have forgotten this, but the Jews have always seen the Sabbath as being this pointer toward the great Sabbath, which is celebrated, the kingdom of God, the bride Shabbat. So it's already there in the first creation account. You have the goal toward which God is pointing creation, the goal toward which we were supposed to move, toward which we got off track. And so creation is about the end as well as the beginning, and it's about everything in between. Now notice I said I want to talk about a realistic doctrine of creation. That is, it is the world that we live in that God has created. It is the world that science works to understand that God has created. God is not the creator of some archaic cosmological model or some kind of fictional world. Now, don't misunderstand that. What we have in the creation accounts in Genesis is not straight history, okay? It uses figurative language, but it is using that kind of language to talk about the creation of the world in which we live. And perhaps most importantly, particularly for those of us who are ordained ministry, but really for all of God's people, God is the creator of this real world in which we are called to carry out our tasks, in which the church is called to carry out its tasks. One of the really key statements that sets out the importance for this whole dialogue between science and religion was made by a Lutheran theologian he made this in connection with a book of essays on the science-religion dialogue. John Mangum, about 20 years ago, he made this statement: today's churches have no other place to fulfill their mission than a world whose basic assumptions are pervaded more and more by science. The scientific world is the one in which the church has to carry out its mission because this is the world in which God has placed us. That does not mean that we should be uncritical about scientific claims. It doesn't mean that we can't raise questions about the uses of science-based technology, but we need to know about them and be aware about them in our ministry. Otherwise, we are just playing let's pretend. Now, the really fundamental thing, however, and coming back to something I said right at the start, as important as creation is, the really fundamental question that comes first is, what God are we talking about? Who is the Creator? For Christians, the Creator is most fully revealed in Jesus Christ, and most particularly in the event of his cross and resurrection. That tells us who God is. It tells us the character of God. And a key part of that I will be referring to later is that important text in Philippians 2, that Christ hymn of Philippians that Paul quotes, "Have this mind among yourselves that you have in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not think equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant." Ekenosan. He emptied himself. And what the precise meaning of that is, various exegetes will debate. But very clearly, in some sense, it means God limits God's self in this process of becoming human and in the course of his human life. He limits himself to the conditions of a creature, to the conditions of being human. This idea of kenosis that comes from that Greek word is going to be very important as we go on in talking about creation. So hold on to that. So, how do we talk about the doctrine of creation in a way that takes very seriously the scientific understanding of the world that has been developed over the past several centuries? First question that I was confronted with of that type in my first parish was not about evolution or the Big Bang. As I remember it, it was in a high school class, and we were talking about something, I think maybe it was the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread." And one high school boy said, "Why do we have to talk about God doing this? I mean, science tells us where our bread comes from. I mean, we can understand where our food comes from. So what does God have to do with it?" And his statement that science can explain it is quite correct, because we can, in considerable detail, describe all the processes of the generation of solar energy and weather and genetics and chemistry and all of the things that go into the grain growing and all the processes of producing bread from grain and so forth. So those are the things that put the bread on our table. What does God have to do with it? But we say that God does. Okay, the eyes of all look to you, and you open your hand and satisfy the desire of every living thing. We pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." What do we think we're praying for when we say that? And of course, it's not just connected with the food on our tables. What is the point of praying for rain, or healing, or safe travel, or anything else, if all of those things can be described pretty well by the laws of physics? And even for Christians who believe that, how do we make sense of it? Okay, do we think that God is going to be performing miracles all the time? How do we understand that claim? Now, things like the Big Bang and biological evolution are very important aspects that we have to address with the doctrine of creation, and I don't want to neglect those at all. I will come to those. But those are not the right place to begin the discussion. If you want to talk about how to understand evolution as a Christian, don't start with evolution or the Big Bang or origins in general. You start with that question of God's action in the world here and now. Because what we will be able to understand about that and what we can say about that will then help us when we come to those questions about origins and those much more debated questions about evolution and things of that sort. I'm struck by the fact that that is also the way in which modern science developed. When science really got started, say in the 17th century with Galileo, Newton, Copernicus in the previous century, at that time, it was not primarily with speculations about the origin of the world or the extent of the universe or that kind of thing. I mean, everybody back then, in Europe at least, pretty much was a young earth creationist. They thought God created the world a few thousand years ago. So those weren't the issues. And of course, they were concerned with astronomy, with the structure of the solar system, which we know now is a very tiny part of the universe. But how science really proceeded is looking at what things go on in our local space-time neighborhood, rolling balls down inclined planes, looking at the motion of pendulums, shining light through lenses and prisms, mixing various chemicals together, collecting bugs and bones and fish and plants and things like that. And understanding the world, our very local part of the world. And developing, with people like Newton, developing laws of mechanics and laws of gravitation, which could then be applied to understand why the planets moved as they do in the solar system, eventually spreading out to understand the motion of stars, being able to study the light emitted by stars and learn something about their compositions and their motions and so forth, all eventually coming to flower in 1929 with Hubble discovering the expansion of the universe, and of course continuing with all the things that we heard in the last couple of days of the microwave background and all of those discoveries. And similarly, in the biological realm, the studies just of these interesting old bones and things that you dig up, and the studies of genetics, beginning with Gregor Mendel counting the numbers of yellow peas and green peas that grew in from various plants, learning about genetics and learning about the history of the earth is what eventually leads to an understanding of biological evolution and modern genetics and all of those areas. And so it's a process of starting in our local space-time neighborhood and then extrapolating outward gradually in order to understand the whole universe. We start here and now and then try to understand there and then. And so I think a similar procedure in theology makes a great deal of sense. And it's a very traditional procedure. I think particularly of the way Martin Luther explains the first article of the Creed in his small catechism. What does it mean, he asked, to say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth? Luther says, I believe that God has created me together with all creatures. Now, that includes everything and presumably includes dinosaurs and distant galaxies and so forth. But then, God has given me and still preserves my body and soul, eyes, ears, and all limbs and senses, reason and all mental faculties. In addition, God daily and abundantly provides shoes and clothing, food and drink, house and home, spouse and children, fields, livestock, and all property, along with all the necessities and nourishment for this body and life, and goes on further in that vein. In other words, God is my creator. God provides what is necessary for my life. God puts bread on my table and shoes on my feet. Luther's a very down-to-earth guy. And so that is the fundamental meaning where we start with the doctrine of creation. But then, back to the original question, how does that fit in with our scientific knowledge? Because science can tell us, and of course it doesn't give all the contingent details of where each person's breakfast came from, but nevertheless, science explains in general where food comes from, and it explains where the shoes get on our feet, and it doesn't explain it in terms of God. And so how do we relate these claims? Now, there are a lot of models that theologians have developed of divine action, a lot of theologies, ways of speaking about how God acts and trying to make sense of the relationship with scientific knowledge. Ian Barber, in his very influential book, Religion and Science, that's used as a textbook for a lot of religion science courses, gives 10 different models, or 10 different theologies that have been developed. And I'm going to actually make use of parts of 3 different ones that I think are most helpful. The first aspect is a very traditional one, goes back at least to St. Thomas Aquinas. It's the idea that God works with and works through creatures. God cooperates with created things in their actions. And if you want to use scholastic language, God is the first cause who acts through second causes. But this idea of cooperation is what's involved here. And if you want an analogy, and you really need an analogy here for this, that God uses creatures as tools or instruments. So God is the worker who makes use of creatures as tools. And those tools range all the way from quarks through human beings and galaxies and electromagnetic fields and everything else. The important thing here is God works, creatures work. Both of them are involved in everything that happens. When you use a wrench to turn a bolt, the wrench turns the bolt, your hand turns the bolt, both of them work. You don't do it with your hand alone. The wrench wouldn't do anything if you didn't turn it. So neither one is working separately. God is the initial cause, but creatures, all creatures, are real causes of things that happen. And so in providing food, just to continue with that important example, God is not one step in that network of processes that takes place to provide food or anything else, but God is involved at every step of the process, all the way from the fusion reactions in the sun that create the energy, all the way to the truck delivering the bread to the supermarket. God is not simply moving inert stuff around in the world, kind of like somebody moving pieces around on a chessboard. The things in the world are really involved in what's going on. And sometimes you see this idea described as not as cooperation, but as concurrence. In fact, that's perhaps a more common word that you'll get in theology texts. I don't like the word concurrence because it means literally that God and creatures sort of just go alongside one another and don't have this idea of cooperation, working together, working with. And this, by the way, this is important when we come to thinking about Genesis and we come thinking about biology. Okay? Genesis 1:11, God said, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation." God does not create vegetation immediately, but the idea is that God has created a world which, when God wants it to happen, is able to bring forth life. Now, this whole thing, in a way, is an analogy. It is not a precise description of how God acts, but an analogy is the best that we're going to get. Sometimes you see in discussions in science theology literature, discussions of the search for the causal joint. That is the idea of, how do we precisely describe how and where God interacts with creatures? I think that is misguided because it views theology as physics. I mean, in physics, if we have two different systems, if we've got an electromagnetic field and we've got a bunch of charged particles, and we know how each operates separately, then you want to figure out how to describe how the fields and the charges interact. And that's quite an appropriate thing to do in physics, but God interacting with creatures is not physics. And so this worker-tool analogy, while it has its limitations, is, I think, the best that we can do. However, having said that, we haven't taken account of a very important aspect of the way things are in the world, namely that things happen in regular ways. That's what science is all about, discovering those regularities, discovering those patterns, the things that we approximate by our laws of physics. If we think of that worker-tool analogy, we can do arbitrary things with tools. Probably most of us, probably more men than women, at some point have whacked a piece of machinery with a hammer when you can't get it working. When everything else fails, you hit it hard. Sometimes it works, amazingly. Or if you want a more sophisticated example, the doctor's in the restaurant and somebody's choking and the Heimlich maneuver doesn't work, and so she gets the steak knife and the plastic straw and performs an emergency tracheotomy. That's not what the steak knife is for. That's not what a plastic drinking straw is for, okay? So you have that sort of jury-rigged arrangement in order to do that. So we can make use of tools in all sorts of arbitrary ways. Apparently that doesn't happen in the world because things do behave in regular ways. And in fact, and here we come back to the use of that idea of kenosis that I referred to. This is what we ought to expect if the Creator is indeed the God who is revealed to us in Jesus Christ, the God who limits himself to the creaturely condition. In working in the world, God not only makes use of creatures as instruments, but God limits what God will do through those instruments to the natural capacities and properties of creatures, the properties with which God has endowed them, in fact. And that, in terms of this picture, that is why science is able to find these regularities that we try to describe by our laws of physics. Or to put it more crudely, God does not violate the laws of nature. God may sometimes violate our approximations to them, but that's a different matter. Things do happen in regular ways. Heat always flows from hot to cold, at least once you get beyond the molecular level. Like electric charges always repel one another. They don't attract. And consequently, we do not see God acting in the world. That is, we do not observe God scientifically. What we observe with all our scientific instrumentation is the tools that God uses. We observe the wrench moving. We don't observe the hand that turns the wrench. That means that creatures are not only God's instruments, not only the tools God uses, but to use a phrase of Martin Luther, they are the masks of God. These things, Luther says, are the masks of God behind which he wishes to remain hidden and to give us all things. God is hidden in this work just as God is hidden in his supreme work of the cross. Because nothing looks less like God than a man dying on a Roman cross. So this is characteristic of the way God works. And the fact that God's activity is hidden in the world is not something that is forced upon us by science, but something that we really ought to expect and is really consistent with our fundamental understanding of who God the Creator is. Now, there's a couple of other things that I have to say about this idea of kenosis, because some writers use this idea in different ways. Kenosis, at least as I use the term, and as I think is validated by Paul's meaning of the word in Philippians 2, kenosis does not mean that God is absent or that God is inactive. It doesn't, when we speak of God's kenotic action, it doesn't mean that most of the time God just isn't doing anything or is off someplace else. It means that while God is always present and always active in everything that takes place, that God limits what is done to creaturely capacities. It's also important, just as Paul, who says that Christ emptied himself, is the same one who said God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. That's what he was doing, but he was doing it by dying on a cross and being raised. I should also say, and people have misunderstood what I've said sometimes, this idea of kenosis is not a complete explanation of how God acts in the world. Some people, reviewers of one of my books, have said Murphy espouses a kenotic theory of creation, according to which da-da-da. Well, kenosis tells us what God doesn't do. God doesn't exceed the capacities of creatures. God doesn't act arbitrarily in the world. But that's not the full understanding, because we have to start with this idea that God is indeed present, God is indeed cooperating with and working through creatures. So you have to have both of those ideas. And there's another aspect. As I said, we do not see God in the sense that we see or observe things scientifically, acting in the world. It is a matter of faith to believe that God is indeed at work, that God does indeed put the food on our table and so forth. And when I say that faith is a component of this understanding of divine action, I don't mean that by saying, well, we don't really have any reason to believe this, but we're just going to say it's true, okay? It is faith as an expression of our trust in the God who has been revealed in Christ, and whom we believe then, on the basis of that, to be the one who is active throughout the universe. As I said, there are a lot of other models of divine action, a lot of other ways of understanding God's ongoing creative activity, this creatio continua, if you want to use some Latin words. I think the approach that I've suggested, the idea of divine cooperation, the kenotic aspect of that, and the role of faith in seeing God at work, I think that's a good way of talking about God's activity. First of all, because it is consistent with and coherent with a theology of the cross, which is, I think, the fundamental kind of theology we ought to pursue. Secondly, in practical terms, it is a very teachable way of speaking about creation. It's teachable and to some extent preachable. Okay? I mean, you can talk to children about what does it mean to say God provides our daily bread. I mean, children can understand the analogy of God working with things as tools and so forth. Adults, even some adults can understand it, okay? So it's, I think, practically a very good one, and some other approaches which maybe some people would say is philosophically preferable. Well, I would debate that, but in any case, I don't think it's terribly useful. Some of those other approaches, I don't think they're terribly useful when you actually come to try to do congregational ministry. So that is how I would talk about God's activity in the world here and now. But now entertain conjecture of a time when creeping murmur and the pouring dark fills the wide vessel of the universe, as Shakespeare put it. Or more prosaically, what about those issues of cosmology and origins that we referred to? What about all those billions of light years and billions of years into the past? Now, some theologies would essentially say we don't need to worry about that. We just need to understand God as my creator, a kind of existential theology. But I am who I am only by virtue of my relationships with other people, with the earth, ultimately with all of creation. I do not really fully understand who I am unless I understand myself as part related to all of you, as related to the whole universe. The carbon in our body that's essential for our bodies was formed by nuclear reactions in earlier generations of stars, spread out by supernovas. Carl Sagan used to say, we are made of star stuff. Well, we are. And in fact, interestingly, come to Ash Wednesday next year, think about that. You know, it's not just remember that you are dust and to dust you shall return. We are made from the ashes of previous stars. And scientific cosmology, and we had some wonderful presentations on this the last couple of days. Scientific cosmology, biological evolution, as I said, developed by extrapolating here and now back to the distant past and far away. We know that cosmic expansion began about 13.7 billion years ago, and we can look back over almost that whole history, back to 10 to the minus 43 seconds, and have, with varying degrees of completeness, have a pretty good understanding of what was happening during all that time. During the first fractions of a second, you have intensely high temperature fields in which as far as we know, all the interactions except maybe gravitation were united. You have a period of inflation during which there was this tremendously rapid acceleration of the universe. The universe then began to cool down, and in that first 3 minutes that Steven Weinberg made famous, the temperature was down to a mere few billion degrees Kelvin, and protons and neutrons were able to fuse briefly, meaning that as a result that about 25% of the mass of what we know about, which is only about 4% of the whole mass of the universe, but about 25% by mass of the atoms in the universe are helium, and the fact that that's the way it is confirms another confirmation of the Big Bang. But then the universe continued to expand and cool down, and when it got to a temperature of a few thousand degrees, electrons and nuclei were able to combine to make atoms and then molecules. In a few more millions of years, creation of stars and galaxies through complex processes of fluid motion and gravitational forces, eventually the formation of some planetary systems, and on at least one of these planetary systems, the formation of life. So science gives us this grand picture of the whole history of the universe, and we then ask the question, what was God doing during all that 13.7 billion years? And if we pursue the approach that I'm suggesting by extrapolating our understanding of God's action in the world, what God was doing was being involved with those unified forces in the first fraction of a second of the universe, and with the nuclear forces in the first 3 minutes to fuse hydrogen into helium, and with the electromagnetic forces and quantum mechanics to form atoms, and with gravitation and mechanical laws to explain the formation of galaxies and planets, and through some process that we don't really understand of biochemistry, eventually to give rise to life and the evolution of life. That is, God is working through all of those processes that science describes in order to bring the universe in the course that God wanted. And God is the originator of all those processes. It's not just that God happened to come across these interactions in this material, but God is the one who brings them into being. But as far as we can see, brings them into being in ways that can be understood in terms of the laws of physics. God is the creator of the fundamental patterns that we try to describe by our laws of physics, which are not just abstract mathematics, but which are kind of embodied mathematics. You can sometimes see T-shirts. People have T-shirts that say, "And God said," and then a bunch of equations, "and there was light." I have a button of that type. I meant to bring it, but when you have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to leave on a plane, you forget things. But the mathematics on that T-shirt are Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism. And they explain, at least in classical terms, explain light. God is their creator. God is the source of the rationality, the logos of the universe. Again, though, we do not see God involved in those processes at the beginning of the universe. Again, God is hidden. One of the astrophysicists, in fact, George Smoot, who got the Nobel Prize for his work in confirming the important properties of the microwave background radiation, at the press conference when this was announced and had this big display of the temperature variations in the microwave background, he said, it's as if we've seen the face of God. No, it's not the face of God. It is one of the masks of God that we have seen in that. The God who is always working in hidden ways. St. Irenaeus said back in the 2nd century, "The Son of God was crucified for all and for everything, having traced the sign of the cross on all things." I've always thought that Haydn got this beautifully. I don't know if he even meant to, in his oratorio, The Creation. You know, the creation begins with several minutes of the music representing the primordial chaos, and then very softly it begins with Genesis 1. And God said, it's in German, and God said, let there, God, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. And then when you get to verse 3, and Gott sprach, es werde Licht, und es war Licht. And there's this tremendous burst of beautiful music, and it's the beauty of creation drowning out the still small voice of the Creator. Biological evolution is part of this story too. It's only the first step, that is, understanding God at work through natural processes. But it is key here, because if we understand that God's creative activity takes place through these natural processes, just as God provides food and brings babies to birth and does all the other things today, then we have cut off right away that whole idea that there's a fundamental dichotomy between creation and evolution. Okay? Don't ever let that word "or" get in there. If somebody says, do you believe in creation or evolution? You got to stop right there. The wrong way of posing the question. Doesn't mean that the theory of evolution is automatically true, but there's no fundamental conflict between the idea of evolution and the idea that God creates through evolution. There are, of course, other tough questions involved with evolution. And the tough questions are things like, did God really create a world in which creatures were dying for millions of years before human beings came on the scene? What about the apparent cruelty that's involved in this process of natural selection that involves competition for resources and all of those things? We have to take those questions seriously, but recall again that the Creator is the one who takes suffering and death on himself. God is on our side in all of this that happens. The God who created a world in which death was part of the natural process is a God himself who is willing to die. God is not only the one who is willing to suffer and die, but in the evolutionary process, in a sense, and at least in the short term, dies on the side of the losers in the struggle for survival. And the resurrection then means that there is hope even for the losers in that struggle. Now, we got started a little bit late, and can I go on for a bit? Okay, because I have a few minor questions that we still need to address. Questions about freedom and prayer and miracles and theodicy, just some small things. Now, the idea that God acts through natural processes, as we described, was a problem for people back in the 18th, 19th century, theologically, during the heyday of Newton's physics. And now, don't misunderstand, Newton's physics was a great edifice and enabled a tremendous amount of understanding of the world. Nobody should speak disparagingly of Newton. Like that Star Trek episode where Newton and Data and Stephen Hawking and Einstein are playing poker, and Hawking starts explaining something to Newton, and Newton says, "Don't patronize me, sir, I invented physics." Which is kind of true. Well, Galileo had something to do with it. But according to Newton's laws of mechanics, if you're looking at some system of bodies, like the solar system, for example, if you know precisely where all those bodies are at one instant, and if you know all the force, and you know how they're moving, if you know their velocities, and if you know all the forces that are acting, then, in principle, you know the whole course of development of the universe for all times in the future, and for that matter, for all times in the past. This is sometimes called Laplacian determinism. Laplace, the great French physicist, set this out. He said if there was an intelligence sufficiently vast that could have all this information about position and velocities and forces, he said the whole universe, the whole course of history, past and future, would lie open before his eyes. And if that's true, and if God acts through natural processes, then you've got a couple choices. Either, first of all, God isn't doing anything in the world. God just sort of set the clockwork in motion, And deism was very popular during this time, and it's not surprising given this picture, because once the universe gets started, it can just keep ticking on. Or God is active, but God's locked into a single course of action, because that's all the laws of physics allow. And so what is the point of praying? For daily bread, for healing, for rain, for anything else? Because that was already determined back at the beginning of the universe. Things changed a lot in the 20th century. Quantum mechanics cut down Laplacian determinism at the root, and so-called chaos theory pretty well chopped up the results. Quantum mechanics says, this is Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that you can't know the positions and velocities all precisely to start with. So you can't have the basic information that Laplacian determinism requires. And then there's so-called chaos theory. As John Polkinghorne has said, and others have said, this is not really a very good name. The fundamental idea of so-called chaos theory is sensitivity to initial conditions. It means that in many physical systems, the Earth's weather system is kind of a paradigmatic example of that, very tiny variations in the way the system starts out will rapidly produce tremendous variations in the future course of development of the system. You've heard of the so-called butterfly effect. The butterfly flapping its wings in Asia produces change in weather, a rainstorm in New York a week later. That kind of idea. And so because we can't know the precise initial conditions precisely, there is this tremendous variation in what the future course of development would be. We will never have absolutely precise long-range weather predicting, in the sense of being able to tell whether or not it's going to rain here 2 years from today, or something like that. Now, that means that the network of events that constitutes the world is much more flexible than classical physics envisioned. Okay? You don't just have a single rigid set of connections, but there's a lot of flexibility there. That means that creatures have some freedom to act. It means God has some freedom to act in the world, even though God constrains himself to acting within the limits of natural processes. That is, God's got a lot of freedom to act, even without doing anything that violates the laws of physics. That means that God can take our prayers into account and doesn't have to perform miracles in order to do it. And that means also that God gives creation some freedom to develop. Everything wasn't kind of hardwired into the Big Bang. God grants creation its own integrity, its own relative independence from God. Now, with a recent prominent Olympic hockey game in mind, I could introduce the next topic by saying, do you believe in miracles? And simply using that quotation is also a reminder to us that we need to stop and think, what do we mean when we say miracle? Because when Al Michaels said, do you believe in miracles, he was not talking about the United States beating the Soviet Union in a hockey game as a violation of the laws of nature, okay? He didn't mean necessarily, I don't know what he thought, I don't know Al Michaels' religious beliefs, but he didn't necessarily mean that God stepped in and did something there. A miracle, the fundamental meaning of miracle, of the word mirabile, is something that people marvel at, things that excite wonder and amazement. And so in that sense, the United States beating the Soviet Union was a miracle. People marveled at it. That's exactly what Al Michaels was doing. It's the miracle on ice and all that kind of thing. A traditional theological idea is that miracles you can only describe something as a miracle if it is something that is completely beyond the capacity of creatures. That creaturely activity could not give rise to this, even with God's cooperation. That is, a miracle has to be produced by the direct and immediate activity of God. Now, does God ever act that way? I don't know. There's no compelling reason theologically to say that God does do that. Actually, there is, and if we think about how to talk about miraculous events, things that excite wonder, things that we can't understand. There is, in fact, a rather famous theorem in mathematics that got a lot of people kind of turned mathematics upside down to a certain extent in 1930 by Kurt Gödel that says that basically in any complex mathematical system, there are always going to be some propositions that you're not going to be able to answer within the system. Okay, they're undecidable propositions, as Gödel said. Now, thinking of the laws of physics as such a mathematical system, that suggests that there are always going to be some questions that physics is not going to be able to answer. Stephen Hawking recently came to that conclusion, that there can never be a complete theory of everything in that sense, precisely because of Gödel's theorem. So maybe miracles, maybe in that sense, some miracles might have something to do with that. But I think there are other ways to talk about miracles. For example, that some of the events that in the Bible that are talked about as miracles can be understood as God's making use of possibilities that God has built into creation, but that they're such rare possibilities that we can never get a handle on them scientifically. And so, they look to us as if somehow they're not connected with the laws of physics. But if you look at the miracle stories, there usually are connections. When Jesus feeds the 5,000, and I like to use this as an example, when Jesus feeds the 5,000, it's not God doing something completely different from what God ever does before, because God is always providing food for creatures, but providing them through all those natural processes that we described. And somehow or other, there are connections that make it possible for that very speeded up and very dramatic kind of thing to happen. There's a wonderful text in one of the tractates in the Talmud, the Pirkei Avot, about the 10 things that were created on the eve of Sabbath, the evening of Friday, on the first week of creation. And what the rabbis were thinking of, this is about 3rd century AD, there are a lot of strange things in the Hebrew scriptures, right? There's the manna, there's the donkey that talked, Balaam's donkey, there's Aaron's rod that budded. Where are those things, when did God create all those things? Because it doesn't say anything about them in the 6 days of creation, but God created everything, and during the first week, they said, well, he must have created them on the evening, just as the sun was going down on Friday. Now, I don't think we should take that literally in the sense that God sort of hardwired the possibility of the feeding of the 5,000 back in the Big Bang, okay? Because chaos theory won't let you do that kind of thing. But I think that suggestion that God built the possibilities for that kind of thing into creation is an interesting way to think about it. Now, that comes to another really important topic, and I don't mean to minimize this. If God can do all this, why do bad things happen in the world? This whole issue of theodicy that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years. One of the few times that I have been embarrassed to be a Christian, which fortunately took place in the privacy of my living room while I was watching the evening news, was after the Indian Ocean tsunami. On the CBS News, they had a segment where they asked various people from various religious communities to, talk about their understanding of what happened. We had 200,000 people killed and all of that. How do you make sense of that? How do you relate this to your idea of the divine? And there was some Hindu and Muslim and Jewish statement. The Christian statesperson, whose denomination I will not identify, it wasn't Methodist, said basically, well, God didn't have anything to do with that. Woe to those who are at ease in Zion. If God doesn't have anything to do with plate tectonics and all the motions of the earth, what does God have to do with? Okay? And I suspect that that's sort of that idea that, God's only some sort of spiritual force or something like that. Well, no. If God is continually active in the world, then God is involved in all those bad things that happen as well as in all the good things that happen. Well, God, as I said, gives creation some freedom. It's not so much that God just lets nature go, as since we're in horse country, we might say God gives nature free rein. Okay, God's still riding the horse, but lets the horse take the natural course. And if we stop and think, in order for the earth to develop as it has, there's got to be plate tectonics, which means there's got to be volcanoes, there's got to be earthquakes and that kind of thing. And if God stepped in to stop every earthquake, every time somebody would get killed, if God stopped every mutation that would lead to cancer, in fact, God would simply be treating creation as a bunch of puppets. So there's no sort of theodicy that's adequate that doesn't recognize that fact. The only kind of serious theodicy, I think, the only kind of justification of God, if you even think that's a legitimate enterprise, is recognizing that the Creator becomes a creature, that he takes the suffering of the world on himself. We and all creatures pay the part of the price of creation being given integrity and freedom. The Christian message is God pays the price as well. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "From the beginning, the world is placed under the sign of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." Thank you.